Welcome. Welcome, everybody. We are here with the Big Why panel, Historical Storytelling Meets Humanities. We are thrilled and just excited to have you join us. And of course, our panelists. We have Dr. Caroline Frink-Reed, Sheila Arnold, Darcy Tucker, Brian Fox Ellis, and of course, our wonderful American Sign Language interpreters. We have Sarah Bro and Michaela Hansen. So we are excited. If you have any comments, whether you are watching this through YouTube, Facebook, or Twitch, you can write in those comments, in those areas where it's popping up, and we will still be able to see your comments. Some of you have already sent in questions. We know we're going to run out of time, but we will do the best we can. And any questions we don't get to, especially those who have registered, or if you email info@storycrossroads.org, we will make sure that we get some kind of answer to you. Maybe not right away, but eventually we will do our best. And anything that you would like to learn about the panelists, all of their resumes are actually on storycrossroads.org/thebigwhy. Every so often, I will put some things in chat so that there will be some links. And we will also have a feedback form, which is also found at that webpage. We are grateful to all of our funders. You already saw a bunch of those, with special attention to Utah Humanities. And we want to just jump in. We're going to run out of time real fast. We want to learn a little bit more. So what's going to happen is that each of our panelists will have about 10 to 15 minutes each, solid time. And that way we are ready for the questions afterwards. So we will start off with Dr. Caroline Frink-Reed. As soon as she has her voice. Yes, there we go.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you today. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Crossroads, for inviting me here to be a part of the panel. Someone once said, history is about storytelling. And historical storytelling begs us to call into question our understanding of what storytelling is. From a performative aspect, the storyteller creates images that transport us, the audience, to another time and space, another dimension. Hence, one of the more familiar openings, Once Upon a Time, or Long, Long Ago. The time and space may be infinite in form or without fixed limits. It derives from the imagination and creativity of the teller. But the historical storyteller, through narrative, must not only create a world for us to inhabit for 10, 15 minutes, maybe more. They must recreate an image of the past and provide, as Kathleen Welch tells us, quote, a way of understanding what we see. Folklorist Jay Anderson would say, it is the simulation of life in another time. The historical storyteller achieves this through the authority of their voice and of clothing and costume born out of an immersion into the history and realities of that time period. How would this character respond to a particular situation? What societal and legal limitations restricted decisions to marry, have children, vote, own a business, farm, or home? Susan Marie Fronczak's motto is, give me a place to stand and I will take you somewhere else. Ms. Fronczak is a portrayal of living history as Marie Curie. She is a former engineer who dabbled in the arts for many years. She took a leave of absence from Hewlett-Packard and she never looked back. Ms. Fronczak also teaches other storytellers who are interested in historical telling. She is a believer and practitioner of the Chautauqua method of historical storytelling performance. The three parts of a Chautauqua performance are: 1, monologue in character; 2, answering questions in character; and 3, answering questions as the scholar behind the performance. Ms. Fronczak teaches her students to ask themselves 3 questions. Why should this person be remembered? And I think that's very important as we go forward. That's a very important question. Why should this person be remembered? That's a question that's being asked all over the nation as some statues are coming down, some schools' names have been changed. But what are the obstacles this person faced in life? And three, what is the historical context of the time period? According to its website, the Chautauqua Institution, originally the Chautauqua Lake Sunday School Assembly, was founded in 1874 as an educational experiment in out-of-school vacation learning. The assembly broadened its courses for Sunday school teachers to include academic subjects, music, art, and physical education. Soon, talent agencies began to put together speakers and entertainment from the Chautauqua movement that traveled to small towns across the United States and Canada. These were known as the Circuit Chautauquas or the Tent Chautauquas. By 1880, the Chautauqua platform had established itself as a national forum for open discussion of public issues, international relations, literature, and science. Charlotte Canning, in her book, The Most American Thing in America, Circuit Chautauqua as Performance, tells us that the Chautauqua movement has been characterized as education, politics, reform, and community building, but rarely as performance. Individual elements, music, elocution, or theater, for example, have been so labeled, but the entire experience has not been understood in that way. Yet, performance offers an analytical framework that carries with it the implications of creation, transformation, accomplishment, and effect, all of which I claim for Chautauqua. And it was this vision and framework of performance that inspired Everett Alberts, former literature professor at Dickinson State University in North Dakota, to revise the Chautauqua experience through historical storytelling. According to George Frein, renowned scholar of Chautauquan history and performance, and once known as the Chief Chautauquan, it was in 1983 or 1984 that Mr. Alberts invited several professors in the humanities to be a part of the storytelling, to be a part of storytelling under the tent. With a grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities and later state humanities councils from Oklahoma, North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, South Dakota, these dedicated professors hit the new Chautauqua circuit during their summers off. As popularity and prominence grew, a governing body was formed, the Great Plains Chautauqua Society, but disbanded after the death of Mr. Everett. But this approach to historical storytelling remains through the dedication and commitment of tellers such as Eileen Evans, Charles Pace, Becky Stone, Joyce Theora, and the aforementioned Susan Marie Fretchak, who practice and offer workshops in the spirit and style of Chautauqua. Chautauquas are still being held in Florida, South Carolina, Kansas, Ohio, Kentucky, Nebraska, to name a few, although I'm sure they have been canceled and rescheduled for 2021. However, Maryland Humanities will sponsor a virtual Chautauqua for 1 month beginning July 6th this year. Of course, the Chautauqua style of storytelling is only one approach to historical storytelling. Ms. Fronchak said if she were to create a Venn diagram of storytelling, historical storytelling would be part of the Venn diagram, and the Chautauqua method would be a small part of that. There are many terms for those practitioners, living history interpreters, heritage interpreters, reenactors, first-person interpreters, oral historians, and or storytellers. It's a universal tendency in societies, or for people in societies, to tell the stories of the heroes, the conquerors, the battles that they won, the winners. The Greek poets told the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the universe's journey through nothingness to being. The Jalis of old Mali told the story of Sunjata Keita, the founder of the Empire of Mali. The bards in the Irish Fili have been characterized as primarily poets, but many studied for years in order to memorize the lore, history, and genealogy. The elders of the indigenous cultures of North America told stories to document their history, customs, rituals, and legends. As storytellers continue to pursue methods, styles, and techniques to recount, retell, and remember history, we, the audience, can only benefit and rejoice in their discoveries. So today, I want you to sit back and listen to these great storytellers coming to us from Crossroads. And I want you to connect to the figures in history that will be presented to you. Some of the voices you may have heard before, some of their histories you may know already. Some will be new to you, but you will be delighted in the journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we will hear from Sheila Arnold, who also will be portraying One Judge, who was a maidservant of Martha Washington. As soon as she has her voice.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. Always having to remember to unmute myself now. Never had to worry about that before. I am so delighted to be here this morning and thank the Utah Humanities in particular, as well as all the other wonderful sponsors for allowing us to come. One of the things that I feel doing historic character interpretation, which is what I call it, which is much more, which is similar to Chautauqua, is that in using historic character presentations, you can do the stories of the unrepresented, and you can share their lives. Often those that are underrepresented or unrepresented, even in textbooks, are the ones whose history has not been written as much. And one of the reasons that we don't have a lot that are from the poor, from women, and from African Americans, particularly those that were slaves, particularly, is because that wasn't written down. People were illiterate. People didn't have the space and the time or the equipment to be able to write things down. Over time, we've been able to learn more about them through things told about them, through research done, through things showing up that happen, and so we can talk about those stories much more now. The more research that we're able to do on those that are underrepresented in our country, in our history, as we talk about history, the more we're able to present them. And one of the great ways to present underrepresented people is through historic character presentations. The person, One Judge, who was the maidservant of Martha Washington, she was little known when I first began to look at her. It's actually because of my friend Darcy, who's on here as well, that when we went to Mount Vernon together, and I had a chance to be on a tour and learn about her. And in learning about her, I wanted to know even more than that. And there was only a historical fiction book that was out with a very little bit of history. And there wasn't much else out. Someone was doing a thesis on her, but I couldn't actually get the thesis. But I began to start look as much as I could and find as much as I could before I began to portray her. Over time, since those times, and I think it's been at least, I've been doing this for 17 years. So at least 14 of these 17 years, I've been portraying One. And over time, there's been little bits that have come out each over time until now. You can find a whole book by Erica Armstrong Dunbar, which is about Never Caught, and that has even more. And having now the chance to have worked at Mount Vernon, I've learned even more from looking at the history because there's more to be found. And I've also found that discussing and using historic character presentations allows us the opportunity to talk about hard things. I'm going to talk about hard things in just a minute. I think what I'd like to do is just for a moment introduce you to One Judge. Now, when I'm doing this with children, I always say, do you want me to turn into her? And the children go, and then I say, now be very quiet. Now you'll be surprised, but I can have a room of 300 early elementary school children, and they are dead silent about what's going to happen. And so this is what I do. My name is One Judge. I was the personal maidservant of Martha Washington. I was born at Mount Vernon. That was the home of Master Washington. My mama's name was Betsy. She was a slave. She also worked with the cloth. She was a weaver and also a seamstress. My daddy was a white indentured servant. His name was William Judge. Do you know what an indentured servant be? Oh, I see. You think you do. That's right. Somebody that works for us on contract. You see, indenture means contract. Oh, you children seem to know so well. So that is how you get to meet One Judge. And that's just a little bit of her. And I'm hoping that you saw that she's very different than me from the way that I sound and the way that I do things. And so, and very rarely would I be talking with my hat, my wig still on my head and be without the right voice. For me, as a performer, once I put at least one last thing on, that's when I become that character. And for One, it just happens to be her wig. But One also, and as well as the other 13 women in history that I portray, also has the opportunity to talk about hard things, things that aren't easy. And as we are talking in our country about difficult issues, one of the greatest ways to do that is through the use of historic characters, because they can say things from the past that we would feel completely unacceptable right now. But in the past, we can say it, so we can put it out there. Now, we're not doing it for the shock value. Well, sometimes we're doing it for the shock value, but the shock value is so that people will begin to think, oh, wow, did they actually say that? Because it reminds us, oh, wow, I don't think people should think that way. And really, we should have that thought process sometimes that, oh, I don't like it when people say that. I don't like it when people do that. And so we get a chance through our characters, oftentimes, to talk about very hard conversations and begin that process of allowing people to kind of check their own selves in the midst of that and to see where their own biases might be, and also begin to express that there's another way of learning and listening, and that we can have a chance to have hard conversations and we don't have to become uncivil. One of the conversations that One Judge often has is the fact that she was a free person, but there's a point in her life where, as good as we make George Washington and Martha Washington, we find that they are not perfect. They're not the images that we have seen before, nor should they have ever been made the images that we have seen before, because they just happen to be human and they made human decisions, ones that we can disagree with, and ones that should help us not see people as put on a statue or put on a pedestal, but ones that we can learn from the good and the bad decisions that they've had in their life. Here's that moment. I like living in Philadelphia. We came to Philadelphia when it became the second capital of the United States. I like the free people in Philadelphia. They had their own trades, their own church. Some had never felt the sting of slavery. Every 5 months or so, mistress would gather up the slaves and take us back to Mount Vernon. I didn't mind. I got to see my mama and my sister. Her name was Philadelphia. I said, I'm leaving Philadelphia to go see Philadelphia. Well, I thought it was funny. One day, I learned why we was returning all the time. I was talking to some free Negroes. They say, don't you know why you leaving? Yes, ma'am. Mistress longing for home. That's not why you going. Yes, it is. And I miss my mama too. Child, don't you know? Don't you know that here in Philadelphia is someone? If a slave stay here 5 months, 6 months without leaving, they can get their freedom. Every 5 months, they was taking us out of Philadelphia. Every 5 months, we was leaving. Every 5 months, she stopped me from being free. I understood then the Washingtons had known all along. And they didn't ne'er want me to be free. I was not a Washington. So using characters, we can actually have that moment where we can have a discussion of how do we put people and why do we put people on pedestals and what decisions people make at certain times and how those decisions affect others' lives. And through a character, we can have it hard where someone isn't saying, but he's the president of the United States. He was the first one. He was the great general. We could say he was also a man. She was also a woman. And they made some decisions that harmed other people. And that we're still dealing with today. That's one of the reasons I love this. I also will say I love it because it grabs people's attention and they stop for a moment and they hear the story of the person from the past. And hopefully, if I do it well, I'm just an hors d'oeuvre. And hopefully they'll go back and want to learn more and they'll gather the whole meal. Thanks for letting me talk today. And thanks for letting me introduce One.
Thank you so much. And now we will hear from Darcy Tucker.
Well, good morning, everybody. I agree with the things that Sheila has said about character interpretation as a great way to present the underrepresented views. And that's not only the views of people who were of a position who were not in power. That's not only the views of minorities or of women, but that can also be minority political views. Maybe not even minority political views, but the political views that don't win at the time. The old saying is that the histories write, the winners write the history books, and that is absolutely true, to the point that when we look back at our nation's history, too often we see people portrayed as good guys and bad guys, when in many cases they simply had different opinions on the way things ought to work. And I think that's particularly relevant today. There is so much vilification going on in politics today, people calling each other un-American because of what their political views are, when the reality is for all of American history and before we were even a nation, people have disagreed with each other. One of the hallmarks of the American system has been that we argue. We bring all these different ideas to the table and we argue about them. And that is what has moved us forward and sometimes backward through history, is that marketplace of ideas and that open discussion. So one of the values I find in character interpretation is giving voice to the political views that now get discounted as being ignorant or the bad guys or what have you. So I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Thompson. Have you seen a carriage? I've been waiting for a carriage. There's a carriage that's due to arrive here at the boarding house to take me to the wharf where I'll board ship for London. My husband is waiting for me in London. I've not seen him in years, and now the carriage is late. You see, we came here in 1768. We had hoped to make a home for ourselves here. My husband is a milliner. He imports all manner of fashionable items, fine printed cottons from India, silks from China, Italian shoes, French perfumes. Well, we'd been told that the people of Charleston, South Carolina, wanted very much to be in fashion, and I dare say we had not been misled, for we could scarce keep the goods on the shelves of our shop. They near flew off. But all anyone would talk about was the taxes. And yes, the taxes had just been raised, but only a very small amount. In point of fact, my husband and I had paid 3 times as much in taxes when we lived in London. 3 times as much as anyone in America was paying, and yet these people complained. And not only that, but the taxes had been raised for good purpose. The British had just fought a very expensive war to expel the French, our age-old enemies, from the frontier. They had made the colonists safer. So why shouldn't the colonists pay at least part of the cost of that war? I found him selfish, in truth. But my husband told me if I wished our business to prosper, I'd best learn to keep my opinions to myself. So I endeavored to do so, and so did he, until the ironically named Sons of Liberty asked him to sign the association. You see, in many of the cities, the gentlemen and the merchants decided that the best way to protest these supposedly unfair taxes was by refusing to import any goods that came through British ports, most especially luxury items. But I remind you, my husband's business was to import luxury items. He couldn't sign that non-importation agreement. Had he done so, he'd have put us out of business. But when he refused, he was tarred and feathered. And he was thrown in prison and then banished from South Carolina. Banished for being loyal to his own country. These patriots, they call themselves. They speak of freedom, they speak of liberty, but they grant it only to those who agree with them on every detail, and woe to you should you disagree. I'm going home. The war is over. I've been trapped here without my husband all these years. I've lost our home, our slaves, all the goods in our shop, while I waited to be reunited with him. But the war is over, and I urge you now to get out while you can. It's not safe to stay here. You've already seen what these so-called patriots do to anyone who disagrees with them. They have yet to form a new government, and when they do, what rights will you have? You know your rights as British subjects. You know, as British subjects, you may disagree with your government. You may print your ideas in the newspaper. You may speak your mind openly. As a British subject, you have the right to a trial by jury, to see the evidence against you, to face your accusers. What rights will these people give you? These people who were so quick to take away the rights of anyone who disagreed with them. I think you're safer if you go back, as I'm going, back to England, where you know your rights. I must be gone. So I find very often that people are stunned to find that there were actually some good reasons to be loyalists, even though at the time, 1/3 of the population remained loyal to the king. That's just as many people as wanted independence. The same number wanted to stay loyal to the king. But the vast majority of Americans don't know that our rights in our Bill of Rights come from the rights of Englishmen. The majority of those people don't know that the protests that happened before the revolution had a real economic impact on Americans as well, put a lot of them out of work. And by portraying someone on the loyalist side and making those points, I can put a human face on people who were not bad guys. They were loyal to their country. They wanted what was the best for their country. They just had a different idea of what was best for their country. And I think that's really important for us to be able to get across to audiences today. So every school that I go to, or now schools that I talk to online, I tell the kids, after they've seen Elizabeth Thompson and a patriot and an undecided character, so they've seen all three viewpoints, I tell them that I want them to stand up for what they believe in the same way that Elizabeth Thompson did. She actually became a spy for the British. She was so convinced that side was right. And I tell the kids to make a list of everything they can think of that's wrong with their world today, and then pick one thing and decide what they personally are going to do to start fixing that problem. Because in my mind, when character interpretation is done right, it's not just education, it's not just entertainment, it inspires people to take active action to change our world now into what we want it to be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Darcy. And now we will hear from Brian Fox Ellis.
Wow, wow, wow. What a thrill and an honor to follow these three strong women, and a tough act to follow. And I'm kind of conflicted because as I've listened to each of you, it's kind of changed. Well, I was going to talk about this. Maybe I should add that. Maybe I should talk about that. So just to respond a little bit to my fellow panelists, I've also been very involved in the Western Plains Chautauqua, and George Frine and Susan Marie Frontenac that you mentioned are all good friends of mine, and to share the stage with them has been really quite an honor. And very much agree that these kinds of stories help you connect with people. I've done a lot of training of young Chautauquans, teaching upper elementary, junior high, and high school kids how to do what we do. And it just blows me away to hear them step into those shoes, bring those stories to life. And it's transformative, not just for the performer, but also for the audience. And the big reason, the big why, that I think this work is important is when I'm at a school and a kid stands up and performs. Well, here's an extreme example. I live in very rural Western Illinois, and our county in my town is very white. And one of the schools I work at, I was a little bit taken aback, but a student wanted to portray Martin Luther King. And he was really impressed and inspired by Martin. And I'm thinking, how are they going to hear this story unless I allow this Caucasian child to tell that story? And of course, he didn't wear blackface. He was very, very conscientious about how he did it. But what moved me is everybody knows the I Have a Dream speech title. Everyone knows the title, but very few people know the speech. And to hear this fifth grade boy stand up and recite a huge chunk of the speech with great drama and passion, I was moved to tears. And I know that his classmates were. And later, because I go to this school every year for several years now, other kids would talk about how inspiring that performance was. And what the light bulb that went on for me was, now Martin Luther King is no longer just a name on a street sign or on a holiday. Their friend portrayed Martin Luther King in the same way that, their other friends were Mary Todd Lincoln or the Wright brothers. They're now friends of these. These historic characters are friends of theirs. And I think that's one of the many reasons why this work is important. And as Sheila was saying, that history, warts and all, and through these voices, we can explore some of the darker elements and some of the things that are often left out of your history book. It is about his story, but it's also about her story. And who are the voices that are left out of the history books? And how do we as performers and historians and scholars give voice to those other perspectives, like the loyalists that Darcy just portrayed? One of the things that I have chosen to kind of specialize in are the friends of important people. Now, on the Chautauqua circuit, they want to hire Abraham Lincoln. They don't necessarily want to hire his friend. And so the programs I do work better in more scholarly venues sometimes than the Chautauqua market. But I love playing the friend of, because then you can see that person from a totally different point of view. So normal summer, I would do 60 shows in Springfield, Illinois. And hopefully next summer you'll get down there. I'll be there again, I hope. And they hire me quite pointedly to play the friends and rivals of Lincoln. And so as a rival of Lincoln, I can say things about Lincoln that are often left out of your history book because we idolize Lincoln, deservedly. But as a friend of, I can also sing his praises in a way that Lincoln would never do for himself. And Billy Herndon is one of my favorite characters. Now imagine that we are in the courtroom in the old state capitol where Lincoln and Herndon, his law partners, tried more than 200 Supreme Court cases. No matter who brought the case to town, to the state Supreme Court, both sides would beat a path to the Lincoln Herndon law office. And if one side didn't hire Lincoln and Herndon, the other side did. And this is one of my favorite stories from that program that I get to perform in the courtroom, in the room where it happened. As the story goes, I must warn you, it begins with a tragedy. Melissa Goings was accused of murder. As the story goes, her husband had knocked her to the ground, was sitting on her chest, strangling her, shouting, "I'm gonna kill you." And she believed him. She reached out and grabbed the only thing she could find, a stick of firewood, and she clubbed him over the head, and he died. And she was going to be hung for murder. Now, Lincoln was in the middle of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but he put his political career on hold to take this trial because he wanted justice to be served. He actually volunteered his services pro bono, I know, because I kept the books and did the accounting, because he wanted justice to be served. Now, his first line of defense was to speak out against the sins of spousal abuse. He said clearly, this woman loved him, if you can love such a monster. She put up with such abuse for 50 years. They had been married. She didn't mean to kill him. But you must understand, in our day, a jury of your peers is a jury of all men. And maybe these men didn't want their wives getting the wrong idea. And Lincoln, as a lawyer, had this uncanny ability to step into the jury box, to read the faces, the impressions, and so unheard of. In the middle of his closing arguments, he completely switches arguments. Instead of arguing against the sins of spousal abuse, he argues for the righteousness of self-defense. He says, put yourself in her shoes. If someone knocked you to the ground, was sitting on your chest, strangling you, shouting, "I'm going to kill you," how many of you'd believe him? How many of you'd defend yourself? Again, Lincoln said, she did not mean to kill him. She thought she loved him. But again, Lincoln saw he wasn't swaying enough of the jury, and he did not want to lose this case. So he turns to the judge and he says, "Excuse me, sir, I need a moment alone with my client." Now, in a small rural courthouse, a moment alone means you're often court's excused for a moment. And Lincoln took his client to a meeting room, and they were gone for a long time. Before the judge calls the court back to order, the jury's in their box. The whole town is there because they all want to hear Mr. Lincoln. And Mr. Lincoln came back in by himself, and he resumed his argument, going on and on against the sins of spousal abuse, speaking for the righteousness of self-defense, often repeating himself, till the judge looks around and realizes the most important person is missing. Melissa Goings is gone. So the judge interrupts Abraham Lincoln and says, "Abraham Lincoln, did you tell your client to flee the court of law?" Lincoln says, "Of course not. If I aid and abet an escape of a wanton criminal, I would sully my reputation, lose my license. I did not tell her to flee." And he turns back to the jury and resumes his argument. And he goes on and on and on, much like this story. When the judge interrupts him again and says, "Well, if you did not tell your client to flee, what exactly did you tell her?" Lincoln said, "Well, my client told me she was thirsty. So I told her, there's some mighty fine water in the state of Tennessee. And she was never seen again in Central Illinois. Now, I'm often asked, so I did the research. Actually, a friend of mine who works at the Metamora Courthouse, where that case originated, he tracked her down through the United States Census. And she took the advice of Horace Greeley, go west, young man, and not so young woman. She lived to the ripe old age of 94 in San Diego, California. And I'm also asked, did Lincoln sully his reputation, lose his license? I found out later that actually Melissa's brother-in-law, the man who died's brother, posted her bail and arranged for Lincoln to take the case. And I could only believe that the entire town was in cahoots because they did not organize any kind of search party. No posse was sent to look for her. And then Lincoln met secretly with the prosecutor a few weeks later, and all charges were dropped. Because Billy Herndon kept the notes, Billy Herndon knows the behind the scenes and the other sides of that story that are often left out of your history books. And it's really fun to tell those stories from that kind of best friend's point of view. And I guess my last point with the big why is, you know, we've heard echoes of this in the other presentations. So I just want to affirm what we've been talking about is when you meet these characters and you hear their stories first person, then you know the story more intimately, and you can shine a little brighter light on something often left in the shadows. And if we don't understand our history, if we don't understand the origins of, like, Juneteenth has been in the news a lot lately. Most of us knew about it for a long time. And if you don't know about it, then you continue to make poor decisions. But it's when we understand our story, and the story is personal, that it gives us a stronger moral foundation for making better choices as we move into the future. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. You can see why they have been selected for today for the Big Why. And we are just honored for you to be here. Now comes the portion where we actually have the questions. And I say we because these don't just come from me or Story Crossroads. We also put it out there for registrants to send in questions. We'll still be watching comments. So if you bring some things up, we will make note of them. We know we can't answer them all, but if you do go to storycrossroads.org/thebigwhy, eventually we hope to have some answers for you there, as well as, of course, the contact information for all of our wonderful panelists. So we can't have every question answered by every single person. We're going to have a couple people answer these different questions. If for some reason you just really want to answer it, panelists, feel free to kind of raise up your hand. Otherwise, I will be very official in saying, I need to hear from so-and-so. And people who are watching and listening, please feel free to share comments. It's always a good etiquette for virtual worlds to share your applause and what you love. And please feel free to do that. So we're going to delve into a little bit of some basics before we get into, you might say, some deeper topics. Now, sometimes we just have to understand some things about how does historical telling differ from acting out of character. And not only that, but can you do more than one character when you are performing in the same session? And the two that we will be answering will be Brian Fox Ellis first, and we will follow that by Darcy Tucker. Panelists, remember, you're in charge of muting and unmuting, so please do that before you talk. So Brian, take it away.
Yeah, and again, kudos to my fellow panelists, because most reenactors choose one character. I have half a dozen friends who play Lincoln or Mark Twain, and it's a lot of work to write a show and develop these characters. So knowing that both Sheila and Darcy play about a dozen characters each, I think I saw the number between us, we have more than 60 characters covered. It is a lot of work, and the research is really my favorite part. Because you find these treasures. It is a treasure hunt. You find these gems that you weren't expecting. But when you're changing characters, so I often do it with hats. This is usually my my Billy Herndon hat, but the lighting in this room and everything, I didn't want to be in the shadows. And you know, a Civil War character, a steamboat captain, and when I put on the hat, that's who I know who I am. And so my costume is sometimes a more general kind of you know, 1850s or 1880s, depending on the time period I'm exploring. And changing the hats allows me to clearly demark that I've changed the character. And it might be a subtle shift in the accent and those kinds of things as well. And maybe I should also mention that Billy Herndon story I just told and the dozen characters I portray have all been turned into books during this shelter at home. So if you go to my Amazon page, you can purchase the book on Billy Herndon and some of the other characters I portray. But the research is the most important thing, because you got to get your facts straight and double check your sources. And then also, you know, the costume for me, it's more a characterization. I'm not what some people call a stitch counter. I admire people who put that kind of time into their costume, but because I'm playing multiple characters, I like a more vague sense of, I'll pass the test, but I'm not wearing historically accurate underwear. So, and Darcy, what is your perspective on? Oh, look, Darcy just changed characters while I was talking. Poof, that was great.
All right. So I actually, my bread and butter is a 3-character play about the American Revolution, and I do the full costume change with each person. So I start out with elements of all 3 characters' costumes on, and I go from someone who is a working level person, different cap, an apron on over this. I have, sorry, I'm out of breath because I was putting this together. Underneath it is Elizabeth Thompson, who you met. And my 3rd character actually was Deborah Sampson, who enlisted as a man in the American Revolution. So for my 3rd character, I'm in full male garb. So what I have underneath my petticoat, it's the same petticoat for both women, but I have the breeches for Deborah Sampson underneath. If I am at an elementary school, kids are going to lose their minds if they actually see me changing clothes in front of them. So I go behind a curtain, but I have it down to, you know, I can do a complete costume change in 30 seconds. If I'm doing it online, which I have been doing recently because the kids are all at home and individually, I don't mind them watching the costume changes, I just turn my back and do the costume changes in front of them. So I am, because I also teach about 18th century clothing, I'm not quite a stitch counter, but I'm a little closer to wanting to make sure everything that I wear is as accurate as possible. That is an artistic choice. And I know that there are some people who all they do is put on one accessory, put on a hat and change the hat to be the next character, and that's their only costume. And as long as your audience knows what to expect, if they know what the visual cue is going to be, then you don't have to do full-blown head-to-toe accurate costuming at all. You can do enough just by changing hats, by changing accessories. So it's just it's an artistic choice. I happen to be a clothes hound. I love playing dress-ups, and so this is my excuse to play dress-ups, and I indulge myself in it.
Well, along the same way, I collect hats, and you probably can't see on the shelf behind me above my library, I have about 40 different hats. I buy a new hat as my reward when I finish writing a show. And you know, some people use the word stitch counter, the term, as in a derogatory. I don't mean it that way, because I really have great admiration. I bought an old quilt shop. And I actually have a woman out there making quilts and crocheting, and there's artists working in my building right now. And I will brag for just a second. This vest is wool from a company that started during the Civil War and made Civil War uniforms and went out of business more than 60 years ago. But somebody gave me a couple yards of wool because I often talk about that company. And then I had a local seamstress make me my Billy Herndon vest.
I love it.
Buttons, if you can't quite see those. So I have great admiration for people like you who do that extra step to get it right.
Well, you know, and the interesting thing for me too is that I can research, but it's not until I'm actually sewing her clothes. And I don't usually make them all the way, but I often take things that I found at thrift shops and whatever and rework them. And when I'm sewing her clothes is when I find her voice. That's when I find that I can climb into that character when her clothes become real.
So wonderful. We have so many questions. I'm going to actually jump to a subject here that is about cultural studies and the importance of cultural studies with historical storytelling. I'd like to direct this one specifically to Dr. Reed. And Sheila, could you also answer right after her? Okay, great.
Rachel, what was this specific question? Did she have a specific question about cultural studies?
Why are cultural studies important for historical storytelling?
I think Brian Fox Ellis touched a little bit on that. The research is so important. And if you are going to portray a character from another time period or specifically another culture, you need to study that culture and that time period. You need to understand what the foods were. Again, as Mr. Ellis said about the vest and the wool, I mean, you have to know that that was the type vest that men wore. You have to get a feel for that. So studying, other cultures opens up an avenue for you, opens up a way for you to get into that character, to learn about the society, the people, the hardships, the obstacles that they went through.
And I will add on that cultural studies is very important. I suppose I actually look at it more as a time period study more than anything else, because there's particular times in history things were done differently. So one of the things that you can do is you can get a book of etiquette. There have been books of etiquette written for centuries, and you can read actually how did a person stand, how did they walk, what did they do. You can learn from books about what games were played, what words were said. I often encourage people to go and read newspapers from the time period and read them out loud, because as you read them out loud, you actually get the feel of how people are communicating, what words they're saying, what is very common. Darcy and I both worked at Colonial Williamsburg, and we get real practiced at learning how to say things, so much so that sometimes we forget we're not at Colonial Williamsburg anymore, and in just normal conversation it comes out. So really learning about the time period. I also use a timeline. When I know a person's life and I'm researching them, one of the things I do at the end is I go on Google and I say, what happened, what was going on in history between their birth and their death? And then I look at those various things, and sometimes along the way, I will see, she might have known about this. They might have known about this. And I want to make sure that I know that, even though I may never present it. And that is true. Most of the stuff that we ever study, most of us never put into anything. But it's the knowledge that it's back there that helps inform how we tell the story.
Yeah. And I'd love
the backstory is so important when you're creating a character. Their backstory. Excuse me, Brian.
No, you kind of took the words out of my mouth. So I portray Walt Whitman, and Walt Whitman was a newspaper writer, and I was able to read newspaper articles that he wrote about what was going on in New York City at that time. And they were later collected into a book he was planning, but died before he finished. And then there's another book I highly recommend that is called Walt Whitman's New York. And it is kind of the timeline of what was going on in New York City culturally and historically during Walt Whitman's time. And I also have a new book coming out that is Walt Whitman's Lincoln. Walt Whitman's best friend was at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Walt wrote a newspaper article that many scholars claim is the best eyewitness account. And so to do a timeline of Lincoln's life and a timeline of Whitman's life, that's actually in the back of my book. And all of my Chautauqua style history in person books, I have a timeline in the back for that very reason. So Sheila, right on for that. That's a very important point.
All right, so many things that we can keep going on about, but we're going to jump to another question. And this one, a few people in the comments with our streaming have talked about the talking of clothing. And if that makes a connection, we're going to connect it more with humanities. So we're going to tweak that and still address what people are talking about online to be about material culture, basically the historical items. We're going to address this first to Darcy, Darcy Tucker, but if Sheila and Brian want to do just short little examples as well, but I'd like Darcy to be able to take this question.
Thank you. I think understanding the material culture is really important. And one of the things that I've done in studying the characters that I portray is, as much as possible, I've tried to go to the places that they lived, to see their actual houses. If the houses aren't there, to actually at least see the landscape. What was the world like where they were? And in places that I've been able to handle their stuff, I've done that because that makes the characters more real for me. It's also a fun part of the research process to learn what existed and what didn't. And when I teach people how to do character interpretation, I tell them that they need to understand the technology of the time. What transportation modes existed and were common? What would an average housewife have in her medicine cabinet? What would she know how to treat at home and what wouldn't she? I need to know, because I deal with some people who were involved in fashion, things like how would this fabric have been printed? What are the different dyes that were being used and the different printing methods? And how expensive would one fabric be as opposed to another one? So that's all part of the person's world, their material culture. The things that the physical things they interact with are just as much a part of their world as the world that we interact with is part of us. So in my mind, you've got to understand what you could buy in the store, what you made at home, how you preserved it, all that kind of stuff, the physical culture part of it, in order to get into the mind of the person.
All right, then Brian, would you like to go next?
Oh, okay. So I'm in my office, so this is kind of easy for me. So I love the material culture aspect. And I like Darcy, I love to go walk. I call it on the ground research, to visit the places that they saw and to actually be able to get into a museum. It's my favorite part of my job because I work for a lot of museums training their staff on how to do this. So I played Prince Maximilian, who was one of the first anthropologists. And actually the term cultural anthropology had not even been created yet. But I am also part Tsalagi or Cherokee. And so he's a great voice to talk about American Indian culture. And I have this great artwork by Carl Bodmer, who Prince Maximilian hired. And I could talk literally for an hour just on the regalia and every element of this gentleman's costume. And this gentleman was so impressed with the paintings that were done of him that he came back the next day, totally different regalia. So here he is as a shaman, and the other painting is him as a warrior, and each piece has a story to tell. And as a cultural anthropologist, to be able to dive deep into that, but as a storyteller, to do the research so I can better interpret those stories is really the fun part of this job. And Sheila?
All right, oh, there we are.
I don't have an answer. So I was trying to say, yeah, go ahead. You're fine.
Oh, not a problem. We have lots of questions. Okay, so I'd like to also delve into history and the stories we tell ourselves, which I think link also to historical storytelling. I would like Dr. Reed, could you answer about how does history link to the stories that we tell ourselves?
When you say the stories we tell ourselves, is that you mean a personal narrative or the refrain or narrative that's running through our head daily, or?
I'd say all of the above. That's exactly why you're the perfect person to answer this.
Well, I used to be a history major. I was a history major, so it kind of comes together, you know. And as a librarian, I love history. History informs not only the present, it will inform the future. Someone, I think Brian Fox Ellis gave us the example today about people talking about Juneteenth. Some people have celebrated Juneteenth since its inception, 100, what is it, 155 years ago. So the stories that run through my head daily, as I make up stories. Well, not so much now, but when I was a librarian and in the library every day, and having to, 3 or 4 classes a day with children, and to come up with a story almost on the spot. I am constantly thinking about history, how my ancestors lived, how, as people have said on this panel, what type of clothes they wore. Did they have shoes? Did they have socks? Did they have utensils? Just day-to-day activities that informed their thinking. They survived. I am so happy that they survived, because that meant that our future is secure. I mean, we could survive, we could go forward. So now when I talk to my grandchildren, these are the kinds of things that I talk to them about. So I guess those are the stories that I tell myself and I tell my family, my children. Just everyday survival. And just let me say a little bit about the storytelling of our ancestors. We just did not tell stories in the open. We had to sometimes tell stories in cane breaks and the hush harbors. And some stories were told at night around a fire, and were told to the children, but they were told to pass on the mores, what was important in the society. So again, that's what I'm doing with my children and my grandchildren. And I say my children, I say the children that I work with, the children that I teach. So I don't know if anybody else
It looks
has
like
any.
Sheila wants to answer that too. So
Okay.
when I see a hand,
There we go.
I'm gonna let you answer.
Well, what I'd like to add onto that is that it's not is it only just our personal stories, it's the narrative of how we think in America. And it's a historical narrative. So for a long time, the history has always been, the stories in our history have generally been about the heroes and the good things that people did and who those good people were. And our stories in our history as Americans have framed for us who were the good and who were the bad, who were the important and who were the insignificant. And that's why stories are so important, and we need to have more clear stories. So to put up to just simply have the story being, and I'll pick on George just for a little bit more, George Washington, that he is the father of our country, but not also talk about that he was a slave owner, means that you only see one side of him, and you don't see the full picture of who he was as a human and in the positions that he was in, or see the fact that he was the one that he was the first one to start to sign in the Fugitive Slave Act. Most people have no idea that he was the first one way back in the 1700s. And they're like, oh, that started later on. And, he didn't have anything to do with that. No, it was going on for a long time. So the stories that we tell actually permeate through us, and we struggle. And that's, I think, where people, if you've ever felt in your life where you feel like, oh, they're revising history, they're just changing history. And it's not revising history. It is adding more of the texture and the layer of history in, because other stories had not been told. So now as you tell those other stories, you get a fuller historical picture. And now we're beginning to tell stories that are including so many other people from so many other views that it may feel like history's new, but right now it really is just fuller and more detailed and more rich. And so the stories that we tell are important, because the stories we don't tell are the ones that we don't look at. And so we can be blind to them. That's all.
And just let me add, as you know, Sheila, if we don't tell them, they will be lost for all time.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are so important that they need to be told.
Amen.
And can I add also that I think people need to keep in mind that we do things today that 200 years from now people will look back and criticize us for. And some of those we know we're doing badly, but others are things that maybe right now are perfectly acceptable and very few people are questioning at all. And so that's one of the things too, that it's really easy to throw rocks at people from the past for the things that they did wrong that were part of their culture at the time, and they weren't really even thinking about right or wrong. It was just the way things were done. And no doubt people will be throwing rocks at us 200 years from now for the same reason, that we're not living up to everything we say.
So we're going to actually move on to another question. There's so many questions. And this one is actually, a few people have brought this up, and I know it could be a long time, but I want you to think about it in the perspective of humanities, of why you are drawn to tell historical stories. I know that each individual character that you have chosen could be a whole long thing of itself, but in the perspective of humanities, of why drawn to that. And by raise a hand of who feels like they're most anxious to answer why they are drawn.
Oh,
Okay, so I'll have Brian first. Okay, then Sheila, then Darcy. So in that order, please. So Brian, Sheila, and then Darcy. But keep it short.
Go ahead, Sheila.
Oh, I'll go first. So, so I am drawn to the historical, particularly character side, because I'm able to tell stories that weren't told. And that to me is the greatest thing of all, is to tell the stories that weren't told, to enhance what we know about our history, to encourage us to have hard conversations or new conversations, and to inspire people to be able to go and begin to research themselves so they can expand on their history.
And yeah, to echo that, there's so many voices left out of our history book, and the more voices we bring to the table, the broader, richer, more diverse the story is, the more nuanced and better the understanding. And from a strictly humanities perspective, I live in the place where history and art and science and literature all come together, and storytelling is a perfect vehicle for tying that together. I would also add that I learned something from every character. I do believe, because I play 4 Friends of Lincoln, it's made me a more honest person. Because I play Charles Darwin, I'm more inquisitive and ask better science questions. Because I play John James Audubon, it's deepened my appreciation for birds and art and science and where those overlap. And I now work a lot at bird watching festivals and go bird watching regularly. So each of these characters make me a better person, expand my horizon, and I hope does the same for my audience. That as they get to know these people, it encourages, inspires, and challenges them to be a little broader person.
All of the above. and also for me, I know that every school I go into, there is at least one kid in that audience who walked in going, oh, I'm going to hate this. This is going to be so boring. I hate history. And I know that I have the power to potentially change that. That if I can get that kid to see history not as dates and dead people, but as real people just like us who faced situations they didn't know how to handle, and they did the best they could and hoped they were doing the right thing, just like us, making it up as they went along, that maybe that kid who walked in saying, I'm going to hate this, will walk out going, that wasn't so bad. And if they say that wasn't so bad, they might actually go online to learn more about that character. And then maybe they'll pick up a book. And who knows, 30 years from now, they may be teaching history. I might be opening a door to a whole new world for some kid in the audience. And that's my goal every school I go into, to change the world for at least one kid.
Darcy, I've met that kid. Isn't it great when you've been doing this as long as we have, to have that kid, now a young adult, email me or friend me on Facebook because they're a teacher now?
Oh, that's awesome.
Stories they heard back when you were entertaining them at Colonial Williamsburg.
That's awesome.
So.
Yes, Rachel.
So I do have a question for Dr. Reed.
Yes.
The question is, how and why does folklore linked to historical storytelling. Folklore, of course, is an element of humanities, and
Yes.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, when I'm working with young adults and some, beginning storytelling classes, that I think maybe on the first session, I put the word folklore on the board or blackboard, whatever board it is, and I just said, let's just dissect this word. What, who are the folk in folklore? So the folk in folklore originally was the common folk, not the elitists, not the monarchy, maybe not the ruling class, but the average everyday folk. What is lore? Lore covers just about everything. It could be poetry, it could be songs, it could be tales, it could be everything. So we put that together and we get the culture from the folk. Now, a lot of times the stories that come from quote unquote average folk, they cannot be documented. Some of the stories that we tell from the historical viewpoint, as Brian was saying, you can document, you can go to the courthouse, you can find records, you can find marriage license. But a lot of times the stories that come from the folk are folk beliefs, but we still can craft those stories. That is still the history because it is the total belief of a culture. For instance, here in Philadelphia, when I was in middle school, as a librarian in the middle school, I was surprised to know that many of the students believed in, I think they call her the green woman or something like that. There was this myth about the green woman and what she would do. It was supposed to be a scary woman that would come around and do something scary to you. But if you could see their faces and their eyes, this was real to them. So, you put a few of those together about the beliefs of a society, the beliefs of a people, it becomes history. It becomes the history of that people. So I don't know if anybody else want to comment.
Well, I play Wilhelm Grimm, and like the Oxford English Dictionary, Daniel Webster, a US Senator, created the Webster's Dictionary, looking at how American English was different from England English. Well, the Grimm brothers, inspired by that, began collecting the origins of German words. And they would look for the oldest use of that word in the folklore. And so again, from a humanities perspective, how do you understand the history of our language? You look at the folklore and the original uses of those words and how those stories were passed down to give us a sense of language as a window into the brain and how people think, how people view the world. And as you were saying very wisely, Doctor, it's the belief system, and the stories encapsulate that and translate it, bring it to life. And a dictionary, on another level, is a way of translating language so that future generations can understand it. And it was through that work, writing a dictionary, that the Grimm brothers became famous for their folklore.
Right. And I, would be surprised as I moved, sometimes went from school to school to find out the beliefs of the children. And they grew up, Philadelphia is large. So children in West Philadelphia believed a certain, believed something, a myth, but the children in South Philly had never heard of it. It was just amazing. It was just schoolyard stories that they told to scare each other. And I just sit and love to hear them. It was great.
I have a question that is actually going to be for all of you. We're getting closer to our time of wrapping up, but I feel this is really important for all of you to say something to this. And there's several questions. So just in case you're watching this, if you're like, why is she asking like 3 questions? It's because I did just send them in their chat so they can read it as well. So we are looking at past, present, and future when it comes to historical storytelling. So how were historical interpretations and presentations being expressed by people? So there's the past. How are they expressed now? There's the present. And as a result of today's current events, how do you see historical storytelling portrayed in the future? So past, present, future. You can answer one or all of those, but if everyone can at least say a little something to each of that. And if you want to raise a hand of who wants to answer it first. Okay, Sheila, you'll be first. So you'll answer first, and who would like to go next? And then Dr. Reed will go next. And then Darcy, and then Brian. Okay, so you remember your order.
So I'm first. Oh, yay. I think that in the past, Dr. Reed did a great job of talking about Chautauquas in the past and how people did things. But all through history, people have been telling stories, all through, the stories of the past. Some of them eventually became things that we call legends today. King Arthur. There probably was a King Arthur somewhere, but we don't know all the details, but his legend is so big that we still tell those stories. There was probably a man named John Henry somewhere or someone like that who worked, but those things, so those stories, those folklores, as Dr. Reed said, there are parts of actual history in each one of them. And so we can sometimes go back and find some of the history that's inside some of the wonderful stories of the past, as well as the fact that we have history that's being passed down from person to person. I think today, one of the ways that we express stories is through historic character, historic character presentations, but also in telling historical stories. I see those two things as different. So there's historic character presentations. I'm in character. I'm showing you a person. And then there's historical storytelling, which I'm just telling you a story. I'm not in character, but I might be telling you a story about a person, about an event, but I'm doing it in such a way that you want to listen to it. It's not just dates and facts. It's actually learning and being excited about what's there. And in the future, I think what's really exciting right now that we're seeing happen today, which is just great, is that everything is bringing up more history. We would have never taught, we're talking about Greenwood in 1921, and we're talking about that right now. And people are telling the story all day long yesterday on the news. They were interviewing people and saying, what do you know about Juneteenth? All day long, people were talking about Juneteenth. And I think that those stories are coming. People are wanting to hear more stories, and they're interested in learning history right now. I think it's a really important time to tell history and tell the stories because people are actually listening. Dr. Reed, I'll pass it off to Dr. Reed.
I had to unmute. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you too for differentiating historical storytelling from telling a historical story. I think that's very important. The other day, Rachel and I met, and we kind of touched upon this. And I remember going through some books here in my house when I first moved in this house and just seeing what I was going to try and throw away or give away. And of course, you just can't go through books without going through books. And I started looking and I started reading. And the books, a lot of them were from the early 70s or mid 70s. And they were about African-American culture. Some of them were poetry, some was short stories. And at some point, I just put the books down, and the feeling, the emotion that came over me was, wow, we were so angry during that time. And so I have to think 20 years from now, when stories are told about people, during this time, will the stories be angry? And Rachel had said to me, well, she said, anger is part, Rach, that's part of going through. What did you say, Rachel?
I said it's part of the grief cycle.
Part of the grief cycle, correctly. And I think that was very, very important. So I think we do have to have some time between to really reflect upon the current events. If I think now, there's a lot of emotion attached to everything that's going on. And so 15, 20 years from now, the story will be different. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
I was thinking about how how history was portrayed in the past, and even before we were a nation, I know they were doing puppet shows, showing historical events and great battles and that kind of thing. People have always been interested in historical stories. But for the longest time, it was always framed in terms of moralism, teaching the heroic stories, focusing only on the good that people did, trying to teach people better behavior through stories. And sometimes it took ironic ways. The stories about George Washington's extreme honesty, his chopping down the cherry tree and not lying about it, was actually not true. You know, it was a lie made up to teach children not to lie. So I think it's interesting that our storytelling has gone from trying to teach morals to trying to just show what actually happened from a lot of perspectives, and hoping that people will draw their own conclusions and think more deeply about what's happening today through it. I see this form of storytelling actually taking off. Everywhere I look now, I'm seeing more and more character interpreters. I know that I think, Brian, you said you teach character interpretation. I know Sheila does. I do also. I've got a book on it. I'll be teaching a course on it this summer, and I have people regularly asking me, how do I do this? Which I think is really encouraging, because what that means is that more and more people are going to be exposed to one of the most effective means of teaching history that I think there is, because it attaches the emotion and it lets people see historical figures as real flesh and blood people.
And yes, yes, and yes, echoing everything said before. Going back to where this conversation started at the hour and a half ago with Dr. Reed, I think the word Chautauqua is a powerful word that I wish everyone would use and be more involved in. I've been doing Chautauquas now for about 20 years. I've created and hosted them, and we are doing a live Chautauqua. You can come to Bishop Hill this summer because we perform in a large park. Everyone can be 6 feet apart. So I have Maya Angelou, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Louisa May Alcott, and I'll be Walt Whitman at my Chautauqua in August, celebrating literary figures. And so the Chautauqua was part of the American movement. And I love the title of that book, The Most American Thing About America, which I think is paraphrased from a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that Dr. Reed mentioned earlier. But also the modern Chautauqua has really been a lot to revive this effort for current storytelling. And by putting different points of view on the stage on the same night, as Darcy was saying earlier in her one-woman show, you know, it really challenges the audience to think, not telling them what to think, but challenging them to think for themselves when they hear these 3 or 4 different points of view. And I think for the future, we are the future right now. I've been doing more and more Zoom and online live storytelling. You know, we can all go to Netflix or History Channel and we can watch whatever we want, whenever we want. But people like that this is more engaging, that they can ask questions and we can be part of a conversation. And so I am also hosting a virtual Chautauqua later this summer. I have, you know, a dozen characters, and since 5 of the Chautauqua that supposedly hired me have postponed until next year, I'm going to do that all on live, I believe, Tuesdays in August, in the morning for younger people and the evening for adults. So watch for that on my Facebook page and everything else, and you can participate. So the past was the Chautauqua. Currently, the Chautauqua movement is what's keeping this alive, and the future will be the virtual Chautauqua, is my hope.
Thank you so much. I love it. Now, at this point, we're going to have closing remarks from each one of them, and they will also share some things that they will be performing in the future. I know a lot of questions we had from registrants were on how to do historical storytelling, though this is called the Big Why. So we were focusing much more in that direction. But when it comes to the research involved, when it comes to all of those kinds of questions, please, you can still ask them. We will still answer them. It just won't be during this panel time. So we acknowledge your questions. We still encourage you to send in questions. And I know that these people will be thrilled to be in touch with you. So make sure that you check out storycrossroads.org/thebigwhy. And you can even watch this afterwards or share it with friends and family and just share them that link, and they can catch up if they had a conflict of schedule. So we're going to have final closing remarks. And so we'll go in the order that we had when we started. So we will start with Dr. Reed, and then we will go to Sheila, then Darcy, and then Brian Fox Ellis. So thank you. As soon as we have your voice, Dr. Reed.
Okay, I thought I had completely gotten lost. Wanted to say thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all of the storytellers today. I certainly enjoyed that. We were taken out of our living rooms, out of our homes, out of our safe places, and we learned so much today. That is the importance of storytelling. Over and over and over, I've heard the storytellers say historical storytelling. It's important to have historical storytelling because of the characterization, and you learn about the characters, but you also learn about the time period, and it brings a better perspective to the present and for the future. And I thank you again.
Thank you again for inviting us, Rachel, and for helping to put this together. I am doing a couple of classes, and so the week of June 29th to July 3rd, I will be teaching historical storytelling through, and that's not character work, but historical storytelling, how to tell the stories of history in a way that's inviting. I'll be doing that from 9 to 10:15 a.m. Eastern Time through Common Ground on the Hill, and you can sign up for that there. And I will also be, and then I will be doing some character work at some point in time. So I'll be doing various character work. Right now I'm doing a lot of storytelling for Black Lives Matter programs or type programs. Black Stories Matter. So that's really important right now. So you'll see me in various places doing that. So
I have, excuse me, been doing what I called Throwback Thursdays for the last 11 or 12 weeks. There'll be a new character this coming Thursday, and you can find out who those characters are by either going to my Facebook, Darcy Tucker Storyteller, or by emailing me, darcy@americanlives.net. So that's every Thursday, 2 performances, different characters. I also am about to launch a 4-week course on how to do character interpretation, how to portray people. And so you'll find more information about that on my course too. That'll be probably in July. I have a book, Embodying the Story Through Character Interpretation, that you can find information about on my website, darcy@americanlives.net. So I hope you will join the fun and try doing character interpretation yourself. And thanks to my fellow panelists, and thank you so much, Rachel, for making this thing happen.
Again, I have the onerous task of following these wise and witty and wonderful women. Echo everything that they just said. This work is so important, and thank you, Rachel, for organizing it. Thank all other three panelists for sharing your wisdom. I've been taking notes all day and learning stuff, and I love that the web allows us to connect. And so Darcy and Sheila, I'll be checking out some of your programs. I just launched a podcast, Foxtails International, available on most of the platforms. I didn't realize it takes a week for some of them to approve and upload, but now I'm on about 6 or 7. I also have a YouTube channel, so you can see shows anytime. And I'm starting to do more virtual work. And I do have a book series that is called History in Person, where eventually by the end of the summer, I will have a dozen of my shows available as an ebook, a paperback. I still like having books in my hand, with a code for an audiobook or a video of the performance. I also have a series called Foxtails Folklore that I've been working on all summer. 3 books are out, a 4th one any day now. Tall Tree Tales, A River of Stories, Prairie Tales, Foxtails, Bird Tales. So it's folklore from around the world with natural history and history, poetry and folklore woven together. And those are available on Amazon. But come to Bishop Hill. I live in a town built in the 1840s. It's a utopian commune. And we've had 0 cases of COVID. We do not have a police force, so we don't have any of those kinds of issues. And we are a bubble in time where we live this history every day. So thank you all. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for coming. And thank you to you, the audience, for great questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thanks to our sign language interpreters.
Yes, thank you so much. And they kept up with us the entire time with no script. Is amazing.
Well, thank you once again. We have our, you might say, credits, because we want to mention our funders, and especially Utah Humanities, who made this possible, and all of the wonderful organizations and individuals who have donated and given. If you feel like this was wonderful and you would like to give a little more, we would just love it, because we will put it forth into great programming. We connect to amazing presenters, and you all, panelists, American Sign Language interpreters, the audience, you have made this a glorious time. I really appreciate it. And so until we tell again, let me roll on with those credits.
And as she's finding the button, let's give everyone a round of applause.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye.